Welcome to my presentation regarding the War on Terror. Today I will be talking about Guantanamo Bay. One of the first instances of the use of the phrase War on Terror was by US President George W. Bush in a speech to Congress just after the 9/11 attacks. He made the statement saying that the War on Terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but there is more than them. He wanted to find and stop every terrorist group around the globe and defeat them all. Many nations joined in on this venture and improved their intelligence and police force and adopting new laws that were quite harsh. Criticism that the War on Terror faces is that rather than strengthening security and stopping acts of terror, it instead creates and promotes violence and creates enemies through an ideology of repression and fear. Guantanamo Bay started in 2002, and it was to be a prison camp aimed to detain very dangerous criminals, interrogate them, and prosecute criminals of war crimes. At Guantanamo, the US government sought to hold detainees in a place neither US or international law applied. The facilities at Guantanamo have become symbolic of gross human rights abuses perpetrated by US government officials in the name of fighting terrorism. The main catalysts for issues surrounding Guantanamo Bay are the powers executed behind actions that occur in Guantanamo. Detainees were sent to Guantanamo Bay to be exploited for intelligence purposes and not to perfect criminal cases against them. There have been 780 detainees since 9/11, and 731 were released without charges after being imprisoned for many years. Prisoners of war from the War on Terror are made to go through illegal detentions and unfair trials. This highlights the issues of the abuse of executive powers. The abuse of power is also reflected through the use of torture the prisoners go through. The lack of laws and the amount of power from officers, it can be suggested that it is a large contributing factor to creating a permissive climate in which abuse and torture is a norm. The fostering of an abusive environment starts to point out the imbalance in needs and expectations of the prisoners versus the law enforcement and security officers. The conflicting interests that exist in this case are the government, the victims and prisoners, and the general public. The government interests lie in capturing prisoners and gaining intelligence from them in the aid for the War on Terror. The government wants the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay to be of use by giving up information and also to get their punishment by being detained. But for the prisoner, they are not even given prisoner of war status. As Avril McDonald explains, Al-Qaeda members are not entitled to it. They are seen as illegal combatants and have to be prosecuted for their participation in any armed conflict they engaged in and for the crimes they committed in the process. The prisoners are victims of torture and unfair trials, where they may have even be entirely innocent. Prisoner interests must account for their safety and health, and whether they are even guilty of the charged crime. The general public may stand on both sides, as information comes to light about the inhumane torture of prisoners, but also to see the necessity of being able to legally and safely interrogate prisoners from combat and war in the Middle East. The needs of all parties are not in balance, and that's one of the issues of Guantanamo Bay. The government needs are prioritized above others. There are complexities that exist of how to coordinate and communicate during the intense real-world conditions of the War on Terror. As Mies explains, Guantanamo has been able to keep away dangerous terrorists from battlefields during their time in the prison. They were able to extract information from them during safe and lawful interrogations. So Guantanamo Bay does have some success, and without the facility, they would not have been able to gather that tactical and strategic information that they needed in aid of the War on Terror. The government started Guantanamo Bay in hopes of assisting with the War on Terror to gain intelligence on the enemy, and the prison does allow for these things to be done. However, with the corruption in forms of the abuse of power, the lack of laws, and the environment that has been created there, it does not achieve these intended aims to the safest and legal and most efficient way. The issues that exist in Guantanamo Bay are the human rights abuse, lack of laws, and that there is no due process given to prisoners in trial. The violations of international law that occur at Guantanamo Bay are unfair trials, indefinite detention, torture, inhumane conditions, and more. The US government are even held unaccountable for these violations. Guantanamo Bay has also become synonymous with the torture of prisoners. The prison violates many human rights laws, and they do not face the consequences for them. Torture should not be a justified act whenever it might prevent some worse things from happening. The absence of laws in Guantanamo Bay is what furthers inhumane practices to occur. As Perlman describes, the United States' actions at Guantanamo Bay violates its obligation under the Third Geneva Convention, the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, and the customary international law. The jurisdiction power in Guantanamo Bay is under a military order that was signed by George Bush in 2001. It actually does not mean international standards of a fair trial. As Head describes, there is no independent or impartial courts, and even lower standards of evidence are allowed, and there is no appeal to a civilian court, and even the president is allowed to detain the accused regardless of the actual outcome of the hearing. As Lubin describes, there have been over 700 inmates in Guantanamo, and many of them were captured in Pakistan or Afghanistan, and they were labeled as enemy combatants, and they were sent to Guantanamo Bay for interrogation and imprisonment. There were many cases of mistaken identity, as they were just captured by Afghani bounty hunters who did not care if they got the correct man. This made a detention camp that was filled with people off the battlefield and even civilians, and all were denied the right to due process and were kept in the facility for years with no opportunity to claim and defend their innocence in front of a safe and unbiased court. The lack of due process speaks volumes of the issues that are occurring in Guantanamo Bay. A case that highlights both perspectives of security and the government as well as human rights and prisoner perspective. The case of David Hicks. David Hicks spent time in Guantanamo Bay from 2002 to 2007. He was placed there as he was caught in Afghanistan in the December of 2001 by the Northern Alliance militia, and they gave him to the US military for a bounty 8 days later. Hicks has a history of volunteering and training under various groups, such as Lashkar-e-Taiba, who were training for deployment against the Indian Army. The LET also sent him to Afghanistan for other training. In the 1990s, he was also volunteered and trained with the Kosovo Liberation Army in Albania. Hence, his history made him quite valuable to the US for interrogation. However, during his time at Guantanamo Bay, he allegedly states he was tortured, painfully bound, chained, hooded, repeatedly beaten by his captors, and interrogated at gunpoint. This case highlights the need to detain and get information from a man who is in direct contact and underwent training with the terrorist groups, but also brings light to the inhumane torture he went through. He represents the need to balance the needs of multiple parties. From discussion so far, it has highlighted the challenges of the war on terror and how it adds to the complexity of the issues of balancing perspectives and needs. President Barack Obama publicly criticized the Bush administration in their execution of the war on terror, and specifically highlighted Guantanamo Bay and its method of interrogation conducted there, and he had plans to shut down the whole prison. He did not get to do it in his time as president, but a solution to the problems of Guantanamo Bay could just be to shut down the whole place, but then other solutions would need to be found for the prisoners of war on terror, and it may just mean opening up another prison in another location. Other recommendations would lie in fixing the legal framework, environment, and having appropriate oversight. As Miller describes, there were attempts at this when some recommendations concerning the fates of detainees were there. There was an issued report that stated they should continue indefinite detention of some prisoners, but also establish a durable and effective framework for holding future detainees captured in the fight against terrorists. They have also expanded in this on 2010 when the President's Task Force issued a case-by-case review of statuses for 240 prisoners that were remaining in Guantanamo Bay. Governments need to start addressing terrorism through international cooperation, using international law and respecting human rights, and perhaps even give focus to the root causes of terrorism so it can be prevented, which in the future would mean less reactive responses like the use of torture for interrogation. Guantanamo Bay exists as the idea created after 9/11 as part of the war on terror to detain people captured during the war. Since 2002, the number of detainees grew over to 700, and issues regarding indefinite detention and legal statuses occurred. Guantanamo Bay has been a symbol of human rights violation and a place of torture. There have been many debates sparked around their methods and procedures, such as how long someone can be held without charge and trial. There have been cases of over 14 years. Guantanamo Bay highlights the complexities of coordination and communication in the war on terror. The interests of the government and security are the ones prioritized in this issue. There needs to be a more balanced set of interests so that prisoners are safe and have their legal and human rights. A big change must overcome Guantanamo Bay, or it must be shut down completely. It cannot keep going as it is. These are my references. Thank you for listening to my presentation.